His sense of balance had not totally escaped him, and Vai'cairn summoned what trained grace he could as to fall as safely as possible. With a painful slap, he hit the water. His limbs shocked with pain, and his wounds stung anew, but he had survived. The cool water rushed around him, driving with an underwater current. Vai'cairn put his pain aside and swam. Though the sea was rough by these cliffs, he was an expert swimmer, as were many of his people. Just as Vai'cairn was about to shoot upwards for air, he spied something, a dark hole in the cliffside, almost directly below where the great stone face entryway was. It wasn't big, but it looked wide enough to accommodate him, and he might have missed it, but lucky for him, his eyes were able to see well in the dim. Could this be a secondary entrance? Thought Vai'cairn. Or perhaps the one above is a trap, and this be the true way in. He did not hesitate, and he swam directly to the underwater passage. He pulled himself inside the dark passageway. It was some sort of flooded tunnel which bore snake-like through the stone, gradually raising in elevation as he progressed. Traversing the watery tube was not difficult at first, but it soon grew much steeper. Vai'cairn's head emerged from above the water level as he looked up. The cramped tunnel rose in front of him steeply, almost at a sheer angle, with cascades of water coming down non-stop. Vai'cairn is going to have to make an athletics check to climb up this part of the tunnel. He rolls and gets a 26, which is definitely a success. Vai'cairn scaled up the rocks which lined the tunnel, enduring the pelting water that surged through the chute. It was testing, but nothing that he couldn't handle. A moment later, he had pulled himself out of the watery tunnel and into a dark chamber of some sort. By the sound of it, it was not a big room, and it was flooded too, for even as he stood, the water came up to his waist. Vai'cairn had hoped his eyes could adjust to the darkness of the chamber, but with no light at all, he couldn't see a thing. He thought about the sodden torch in his belt. He knew the oil might still catch, but with the torch itself soaked, the flame wouldn't keep, so he decided to rest for a while, waiting for the pain in his limbs to subside, and trying his best to dry out the torch. When Vai'cairn felt ready, he took out his flint and steel and lit his torch. The flame sputtered to life and continued to flicker and sizzle from the damp spots that it still held. The small room around him was illuminated, though, and it looked very old. Other than the tunnel through which he entered, there was no apparent exit. Whatever etching had been done on the walls had been worn all but completely away by time and water. He couldn't make anything out. A stone statue stood along one of the walls. It was about the shape and size of a short man, but again, all of its detail had been claimed long ago. Vai'cairn looked about, searching for any other clue as to this chamber's purpose. He did not like the idea of having to go back to the cliffside path once more. Vai'cairn's going to make a perception check to search. He actually gets a 21, which is pretty good for him. He rolled a natural 20. He notices something. At the submerged base of the statue, Vai'cairn noticed there were rough marks in the floor on one side of the statue, as if it had been dragged in that direction many times before. Perhaps this will show another way through. Alright, Vai'cairn is going to make a strength check to try to push that statue in the direction that it looks like it's been pushed many times before. He actually fails 5 strength checks in a row. He gets an 11, a 6, a 12, another 11, and a 16. He's getting a little bit worn out, so he's going to have to make an endurance check. His endurance check is a 23, definitely a success. He's going to keep going. He makes 5 more strength checks, and again fails all 5, does even worse. He makes another endurance check, this time failing. He gets a 12 and he fails. Vai'cairn struggled against the heavy statue, finding it hard to gain good leverage in the water. That and the stone was very heavy. He was finding that he was getting worn out. Finally, after a few minutes of determined struggling, the ancient stone statue, which had probably not moved for many centuries, ground across the floor. As it did, Vai'cairn heard the wall behind him begin to creak and shift, revealing a hidden passage. Vai'cairn looked out into what lay beyond. Within the flickering glow of his torch, he saw a larger chamber, with one of its walls partially collapsed in. Directly ahead were 3 similar statues, one of which clearly was shifted back from the rest. As Vai'cairn stepped cautiously into the flooded chamber, he noticed that the wall to his right held carvings that could still be distinguished. They appeared as some form of ancient script, mostly runes and glyphs of meaning which he knew not. Here and there was a depiction of some great creature, fantastic, half-humanoid beasts, the like of which he had never seen nor heard of. One of the creatures resembled a muscular, crawling man with the traits of an orca whale. He was surrounded by what appeared to be worshipping people which were greatly dwarfed by the size of this whale being. Vai'cairn approached the carvings to get a better look. They were eroded much, but he could see that the people paying reverence to the whale being all wore masks over their faces. He knew these engravings in the stone wall reminded him of something the shamans had taught the village about. He's going to make a history check to see if he remembers any specific knowledge. His history check is an 18. That is a success. These inscriptions, as well as this entire structure, were made by an ancient race known as the Hyrosians. It was said that at one point in time, they were very numerous and ruled all of Nival, and even further. They wore masks at all times, and indeed, ceremony, ritual, and even war became their way of life. The Hyrosians worshipped many obscure gods, not known about anymore, and believed that they could communicate directly with them. What happened to the Hyrosians is not exactly known, and all that remains of their people today are a savage and monstrous descendant known as the Hyrogs. Vai'cairn felt an eerie presence in front of the carving, as if he was staring into a different place and time altogether, and in a way, he was. He took a deep breath and decided that this was something out of the scope of his skill. Strange whale gods and dead races offer nothing to me. I wonder if this really is the place that Veneth foresaw me finding. Vai'cairn decided he should just give the wall one more look over, just to check and see if anything else caught his eye. He makes a perception check. He gets a 9, which isn't very high, but luckily he does spot something which is kind of easy to spot. Faintly glinting by the light of his torch, Vai'cairn noticed that the eye of the whale being held a pearl. Such a gem would be a prized treasure, so he drew his long spear and went to pry it out with the spear tip. As he touched the gem, a strange sound echoed through the chamber. It was like a guttural chant of some deep-voiced priest, monosyllabic and resounding. It filled Vai'cairn with a momentary sense of dread. He paused for a moment, suddenly uncertain of whether or not to take that gem.